Hi, my name is Dr. Kate Drabinski, and I teach gender, women's, and sexuality studies at UMBC. I also am a major history buff, and Baltimore City is my favorite city to learn and teach about. If this were a regular summer, special sessions would be taking us all on a walking tour of Camden Yards to learn about its role in building the city. Because we can't do that in person, I've prepared this short virtual tour to help you learn a little bit about Camden Yards. Trains were incredibly important to the growth of Baltimore. The first railway chartered for freight and passengers was the B&O Railroad in February 1827. The first stone was laid July 4th, 1828. Baltimore was hoping the railroad would help the city compete with New York City for business and population. The warehouse that forms the eastern edge of the ballpark was built starting in 1869 and finished in 1905. It was the longest brick building on the East Coast at that time. It was used by the railroad for storage and distribution through the 1960s, when trucks took over much of the freight moving business, and the railroad moved to smaller one-story warehouses in industrial parks outside of the city. You'll see that the pictures I could get just can't capture the length of this building. When turned on its side, it would have been one of the tallest buildings in the entire country. My favorite story about Camden Yards is that it was the site of an important general strike. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and moved north to Baltimore and beyond. Workers were protesting the third pay cut in a year as stock returns held steady. Workers refused to let any trains move until that third pay cut was rolled back. The National Guard was called out to suppress the strike in West Virginia, but soldiers refused to fire on striking workers. In Baltimore, the 5th and 6th Regiments of the State Guard gathered at Phoenix Shot Tower, just east of Camden Yards, and marched through angry crowds of workers and supportive members of the public. They eventually fired on the crowd, killing 10 and wounding 25. They were eventually surrounded by strikers and their allies, and the U.S. Marines and federal troops were sent in to, quote, rescue them. This story is important for understanding the role of the state in mediating between labor and capital. Whose side are they on? And what agency did and do individual soldiers or police have to refuse state-ordered violence? The strike worked in many ways, giving birth to the country's first pension programs, as well as increasing unionization efforts across industries. It was also a spur to building more elaborate National Guards, as the state saw the deployment of the military as the only answer to quelling labor unrest. What else could have been done and could be done so workers are paid fairly and provided with safe working conditions? I love history precisely because it forces us to imagine ways things could be otherwise. I'm going to bring us up to the present now to talk about the Camden Yards most of you are more familiar with. Construction on the stadium began in 1988 and the ballpark opened in 1992. The architects and builders decided to save the buildings surrounding what would become the ballpark, and Orioles Park at Camden Yards became the first in a string of stadium redesigns that sought to build on nostalgia for the parks of old. The stadium seats over 45,000 people, and every seat is a good one. Do you know what else happened in 1992? Baltimore's light rail system. The system was planned and construction began in the 1980s, but it first opened with just a few stations, mostly to serve the baseball stadium. The rest of the line was built out through the 1990s. This history makes me think about who we build public transit for and why. The light rail is used by all kinds of people, but it was first opened to move suburb dwellers to the ballpark, a boon for, you guessed it, the people who are invested in baseball. The question of who a city develops for and why persists all over downtown Baltimore, from the city-owned Baltimore Hilton to the Inner Harbor and east. How resources are distributed to build up some parts of the city over others is a political decision, one that etches in the built environment the answers to the question, who has a right to the city? These questions are always relevant, and as we come out of lockdown, and Baltimore, like every place, has to figure out how to rebuild the economy, These questions and the history of its answers must remain at the forefront of our minds. Thank you for joining me on this virtual tour, and I can't wait to see you in person to walk around the city soon.